So at the end of chapter 44, in verse 28, you're introduced to this character by name, Cyrus, who's going to be the king of Persia to overthrow Babylon very quickly. And quite frankly, I think most of the people who were captive to Babylon were very grateful to see Babylon fall.
Yeah, in Jewish history, the Assyrians and the Babylonians are remembered as the bad guys, terrible. But the Persians are actually remembered as the good guys. Yeah. They're the ones who let them go from Babylon. The Persians, when they conquered, they even gave back the temple treasures that had been looted and some money to go back and rebuild. So in biblical history, the Persians are remembered quite positively, starting with Cyrus right here.
Yeah, so you'll remember that from our episode on Ezra and Nehemiah, where we talked about that return to Jerusalem under Cyrus's direction and blessing and giving all of these things back. You'll notice chapter 45, verse 1, then the Lord now speaks to Cyrus, but refers to him as the anointed, his anointed, a Mashiach, a Messiah figure. And Cyrus isn't in the house of Israel.
Yeah. And I think one thing that demonstrates here, I mean, because he calls Cyrus his anointed, he calls him a servant. And it's not just in 45 here. There's several little bits and pieces of Cyrus, even when he's not named, that come up in these chapters. And it's clear the Lord's working through him. And I think that's a wonderful reminder that the Lord can work through people who are not necessarily in the covenant right now. Someone who you might call a Gentile, maybe today in our parlance would say is a non-member, someone like that, right? The Lord is working through more people and more nations than just us to accomplish his purposes. He does have a prophet and he does have channels he works through, but the world's problems, quite frankly, are too big for the few Latter-day Saints there are to handle. And it's wonderful to see examples like this where the Lord is clearly using others to accomplish his purposes and do the good he needs to do in the world.
Powerful.
Another lesson that comes up here, so he promises that he's going to use Cyrus, right? So 45 verses 1, he's going to use him to subdue nations and to, throw down kings and all this, because Babylon's going to fall. But then there's this sense here starting in verse 9 that maybe some people among the Israelites in exile were uncomfortable with this, that they questioned the wisdom of using Cyrus. And it doesn't say why, maybe because he's a Gentile, maybe for some other reason. But then in verses 9 through 13, the prophet gives this kind of answer to people questioning God's plans here. So verse 9, woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. And that the grammar is kind of convoluted there, but it's basically saying, the earth is full. You're just one of these many pieces of broken pottery among many. Who are you to question the one who made the pot? Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou? Or thy work, he hath no hands. So that the clay complaining to the potter about what he's doing. The potter's the one who has the master plan here. And then it continues on with saying the same thing in verse 10. Verse 11 says, thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel and his maker. Ask me of things to come concerning my sons or my children, and concerning the work of my hands, command ye. But this is really should be a question. Like, are you going to ask me about what I do with my kids, or question, are you going to command what I'm doing? I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their hosts have I commanded. Which means it's pretty presumptuous to question him. And in verse 13, he says, I have raised him, Cyrus, up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, probably a reference to Jerusalem being rebuilt, and he shall let go my captives, not for price or reward, saith the Lord of hosts. And I think this is just such an interesting kind of rebuke to them, because how many times do we question the Lord's plans and say, as clay saying to the potter, what do you think you're doing right here, right? It takes tremendous trust, I think, to know that the Lord is the master builder. He's the one fashioning us. And to say, you know what, I don't get what's going on right now, and I question some of your methods maybe, but I'm going to trust that you have a long-term plan and that you know what you're doing, and I'm going to trust that. And I know someday that will make sense.
And for any of you who've spent any time working with clay or spinning a wheel with making a pot, you recognize that if the clay is hardened, it's not going to be shaped or fashioned the way the potter wants it to. It'll be ruined. What a beautiful allusion back to this softening of the heart, this meekness, acknowledging who we are compared to God and giving our life over to him to say, dear God on high, you don't have to take anything away from me. President Boyd K. Packer used to use that phrase. You don't have to take anything from me because I give it all to thee freely. Shape me, mold me to be the instrument or the vessel that thou needs to be able to do thy work. It's such a beautiful discipleship imagery for us on this covenant path, this complete submission of a soft heart to be molded and shaped, which might mean at times that it hurts because maybe we're going to be pulled and stretched in directions and in ways that we didn't think possible or even reasonable in the past.
Well, he turns this into a work of art.